All right, good afternoon. Welcome to our 1 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time session. We will turn the time over to Phil O'Donnell for risk impact and cold weather.
Thank you, Maylee. And welcome back, everyone, from your virtual lunch. Hope you enjoyed it. Let's see, I'm going to be discussing risk impacts and cold weather, and it's kind of related to audit approaches that we'll take once we get into the field and start doing audit items. Could go to the next slide, please. So one of the things we're going to look at EOP 11-2 and how this might address risk to the BES from cold weather events, and understand how site-specific conditions and equipment can have an impact on the approaches or techniques that we use at an audit. This isn't intended to be a detailed look at EOP 11-2. There's been a significant amount of outreach performed for this standard. It's becoming effective here 1st of April. But it's a look as an example of how a standard with the exact same language can be quite diverse, how it gets applied to different facilities and different organizations. So I'm going to be discussing a couple of monitoring considerations for two different entities, the same two that we've discussed before. The assumption here is the risk group has done all the things that that Patrick and Scott discussed earlier and have come up with an audit scope. That audit scope has been handed over to the auditors, and now it's our job to go out and perform this audit engagement and look at these standards. So we have all that background. One of the things that I wanted to say as I go through this, that although it sounds like our whole theme for this session has been, a tale of two entities and comparisons between two entities, but I want to just emphasize that this is sort of a thought exercise. And when we set up an audit scope, we set up an audit approach, we're not looking at company A versus company B. Company A, good player, company B, bad player. And we're not looking at, we want to say that one's better than the other. So I want to emphasize we don't try and score entities or compare them. Not that A is better than B, so B gets a harder audit. More likely, we're looking at the risks. Is the risks from A may be different than the risks at B, therefore the approach to audit may be different between the two. And as Scott and Patrick mentioned in the last session, that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways: controls, compliance culture, systems, and configuration. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for EOP, how this works for EOP 11-2. So next slide, please. So what we have is, in this case, we're assuming we have a new standard or requirement without any previous compliance history, and it may be looked at differently. Any new standard is a blank slate. By definition, there's no performance history to consider. Sometimes we get clues from how an entity approaches standards in general, but we don't have any hard data with respect to these particular requirements. Now, in some cases, not necessarily WCC, there is some history based on some events that occurred in the past due to cold weather, which was the motivating factors for why these standards were even developed. But reliability and resilience to cold weather conditions and mitigating those related risks is a high-profile concern with FERC due to the history of these recent events. We can see variable risks can result in different approaches at audit. So we can look, as was discussed previously, inherent risk, history of internal compliance programs, and internal controls may have impact on the level of inquiry to satisfy reasonable assurance of compliance. In the past, we have discussed a risk-based CMEP, and everyone is pretty much familiar that we're trying to tailor the audit scope and include standards that have a certain level of risk. But the assumption has been, once those standards get into the audit scope, now they're treated by the auditors exactly the same. And I'd like to consider that maybe that may not necessarily be true, that auditors can also consider some risk and some things that they see as they perform audits that can flavor or impact the approaches they take, which will result in a different experience for the different entities that are being audited. Next slide, please. So here's the only things that WEC can do. I mean, we want to say that we want to ensure a reliable bulk electric system and secure bulk electric system, but we do not operate the power systems. We don't do that. All of you folks do that. You're the ones that actually implement and make the bulk electric system reliable and secure. What we can do is we can identify the risk to reliability, bring them out into the sunlight. The ERO can, we can identify compliance and non-compliance with standards that are put in place to enhance and ensure reliability. And assuming that those standards address actual risk by requiring mitigation for the non-compliance with those standards, we make an effort and we make headway at making the system more reliable. In a perfect world, that would be great. Ideally, you would identify your risk. You would write a standard that addresses that risk and completely mitigates that risk. And then all we have to do is make sure that you're compliant with that standard and that the risk basically goes away. But we all know that standards aren't perfect. They have to apply to a wide range of facilities, a wide range of organizations over a very wide area, entire North American continent. And so the standards may not always fully address the risk that we're trying to mitigate. So the other step we have is we encourage mitigation of risk through various outreach. And that outreach, in addition to what we're doing now and to seminars and things on cold weather or on specific standards as they're being implemented, it also includes during audit engagements, recommendations, area of concerns, things that highlight weaknesses that we would like to see mitigated, but that may not approach a non-compliance with a standard. So how this gets looked at is very dependent on the entity and to a certain extent on the auditors. Next slide, please. So consideration for audit approaches, this is what we know. With any standard, we go in with the requirement itself. We're going to be doing, we were assigned to do requirement 7 and requirement 8, which are applicable to the generator operator. Their new requirements have never been assessed. So there's not much history, and we're not really saying exactly at what point this audit is occurring. It might be 1 year into the implementation. It might be 3 weeks after the implementation. But we know what the rules are, and we'll cover those a little bit later. Then we know entity information, as Scott and Patrick mentioned earlier. We have entity information. We know their compliance and their performance history in general, not for this requirement, but for others. We also know what the location of their facilities are with respect to cold weather and what types of facilities they might be, and the different types of facilities. Each type of facility has an inherent risk or resilience to cold weather performance. Next slide, please. So here's our audit approach options that we have. We have a checkbox audit, which is essentially when people asked a question earlier, well, the RSAWs are really valuable to get the questions and get the audit approaches. The RSAWs do represent sort of a checkbox audit. We have very specific things that we look for. They're usually taken out of the measures for a standard. And we determine, are you compliant? And we can look at every entity just about the same way. If you're compliant, that's good, you get a check. If you're not compliant, then we find a possible non-compliance that leads into some sort of forced mitigation, even whether it's a compliance exception, an FFT, or any other kind of a penalty. It requires you to come back in compliance with that standard. Now that's the norm. That's the norm that most of you are familiar with. That's what auditors typically tend to do. It would be completely satisfactory, I said again, if the standards were perfect. If merely complying with the wording of the standard was all that was needed to ensure that a risk was mitigated, this would be the way to do an audit. But what if we take a different approach and even with the same standard, consider the different risks and what we're trying to accomplish by even performing this audit. Why are we doing this? And use some flexibility to change the audit approach to more accurately address the risk that exists. So sometimes it may go a bit beyond the black and white of the standard, and that makes some people uncomfortable. But what we're trying to do here is this gets as we implement or go this direction, is just try and make awareness to the entity to be as robust as they can in mitigating the risk we're looking for. Next slide, please. So in the case of EOP 11, there's a target risk, and we've discussed this before, that there are two kinds of risks that can be looked at. One is a risk that a registered entity would not be compliant with a given requirement. Now, like I said again, if the standard is perfect, that might be okay. But there are some different levels of challenge to being compliant with a requirement, and there are different risks associated with not being compliant. If you have 7,000 protective relays to maintain, missing a 6-year maintenance interval and doing the performance in 6 years and 7 months, that's a non-compliance with the standard, black and white. Is it a significant risk? Is it really a threat to the reliability of the BES that minor issue was missed? Now, that in many cases is addressed during an enforcement process when they realize, hey, this is a low impact. But rather than focusing on whether or not you'll be compliant with a given requirement and what that risk would be, another risk to consider for EOP 11.2 is the risk of unplanned and widespread loss of resources during a severe cold weather event. That we have experienced this on at least 3 or 4 occasions in the US. Fortunately, the Western interconnection has been relatively hands-off in this area of these large issues, but it certainly could apply to us. We do have some very severe weather, both in terms of temperatures and precipitation, freezing, things like that. So we kind of look at what is the target risk. And then for any of you that are familiar with EOP 11-2 as it exists right now, you can ask yourself, just because they wrote this new standard, EOP 11-2, and made it applicable to the generator owners, does this standard as it exists right now mitigate the target risk to the BES? And I think that depends a lot on what you consider the word mitigate means. If you think it helps, then I would say, well, sure, it helps. It's a step in the right direction. But if you think mitigate means eliminate or drastically reduce that risk, EOP 11, I think anyone would recognize that by itself, it does not accomplish that. If it did, there wouldn't be an EOP 12 that was recently approved, and there wouldn't be another phase of EOP 11 being considered by the drafting teams right now. So this is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't completely address the risk of an unplanned and widespread loss of resources. So the auditors may want to focus on some things that may not be in black and white in that standard as suggestions and outreach to bring a little bit better attention and understanding of what we're trying to do, and maybe get this risk mitigated ahead of the standards rather than behind the standards, as is the typical case with regulation. So next slide, please. So possible audit approaches. This is pretty much all the tools that we have in our tool bag as far as doing an audit. We can review and assess entity documents, which are pre-made documents, plans, procedures, or we can look at documents that represent records and logs of performance to see if something's been performed. We can hold interviews and discussions. We can do site visits and observations and watch things. And in some cases, we could test out, we could revalidate calculations and things of this nature. But that's all we can do. It's the only issues that we have, the only things that we can do. We could do all of these things for every requirement. We could ask some some level of all of these bullet points for every requirement, but we don't do that. And everyone knows we don't do that. Sometimes just the review of the plans procedures is enough. Sometimes we have to go into look at logs and records. Sometimes we do sampling. One of the biggest areas right now where auditors have some flexibility to address risk in their audit approach is how much and how we address judgmental sampling. For example, we're going to focus on for FAC 3 for vegetation management. We're going to try and find areas where tree growth may be fast and may be a problem. And that's going to be areas that we tend to focus on, not as much on the dry areas with shrubs and low brush. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about these standards themselves that we're auditing. And just as a heads up, I'm not going to be, these are paraphrased. I didn't include the full language of the standards because this isn't really intended to be a standard briefing. It's just meant to steer you through a little bit of what our audit approach considerations might be. So it says they have to implement and maintain one or more cold weather preparedness plans for its generating units. This is brand new. This is the first time that a GO has been asked to create an emergency preparedness plan. They are addressed in the EOPs in a couple areas for testing black start generators and participating in restoration drills when necessary. But in general, the EOPs aren't, they don't fall on the shoulders of generator owners. So this is kind of new. This says implement and maintain. If you look at all of our EOP or various standards, you'll say in some case we say develop and implement. In some cases we just say have a plan. In some cases we say develop, maintain, and implement. So this is just language the drafting team put out there, but essentially would be looking that there has to be this document, this formal document in existence. It may be one document or maybe multiple documents. And the idea of maintaining it is that as things change, as your facilities change, that you may have to update this document and make sure that it's that it keeps up with your assets. There are 7 items that have to be included in this plan. Next slide, please. So one of the things your plan has to address your generating units freeze protection measures. And it's not very specific on what those are. It's not a well-defined term. When I first read this term, I thought, oh, that means heat tracing that's applied to piping. Coming from a thermal plant that had some cold weather experience, that was an important thing to have. But it doesn't necessarily have to be just the trace heat. It can be cabinetry that's heated. It can be an indoor building that's maintained at a certain temperature during winter. It can be temporary constructs of tents or in portable heaters. It covers a wide variety of possible things. So it says you have to have your plan has to address these freeze protection measures. Annual inspection and maintenance of the generating units, their freeze protection measures. That's a pretty straightforward. Do this once a year and have records for it. The next bullets, all the next bullets down there are all about knowing the capability of your plant and knowing how it can function and what its resilience is to cold weather. And that includes its basic capability and availability during cold conditions. Some units may have fuel supply and inventory issues that can have to think about. Some have fuel switching capabilities. Some might have environmental constraints. Some might have environmental constraints that can be relieved or reduced during emergencies. And then there should be a minimum operating temperature that is communicated that this is where we can operate. We can guarantee operation at this point. Below this, there's no guarantees. So these things are, we know these things. I mean, who knows this better? Would it be you as the entity or the auditor when he comes in? And so there's a certain amount of deference to the auditor. Shouldn't be telling you what these things are. This is something that you should be communicating to the auditor and to your people in your plan. What an auditor does know that a generating facility that is located in and operates in northern Minnesota is most likely going to have this cold weather thing down, unless there's been some unusual history of events associated with the unit due to freezing, that facilities and generation asset owners who operate facilities in weather that typically gets very cold every year, their units are typically pretty resilient for cold weather operation. Whereas we would know that a unit that existed down in a very moderate climate that only had rare dips into the cold weather may not consider that much of a risk, because any generator can trip. So up until now, there hasn't been that much of a an emphasis on keeping your generator going. The solution to most generator emergencies is to shut down the generator. But here's a case where we don't want generators to shut down. So a power plant operator in New Mexico, Texas area, in our region, those are areas where we might want to be concerned about, have they made changes and adjust for this new standard. Next slide. So requirement 8 is for each generator, in conjunction with generator operator, identify the entity responsible for providing the generating unit specific training, and then provide that training to its maintenance or operations personnel responsible for implementing the cold weather plan that you develop for R7. So training is always a good thing. So we always like to include the training, make sure everybody can implement the plan, particularly if the idea is this is a rarely implemented plan. It's not expected to be done very often. So to get it set up and train people on what to do, the initial cold weather standards here, EOP 11, simply require initial training for each operator or maintenance personnel. The subsequent standards are going to require that to be more frequent, to be on interval based. I believe an annual is what they're going to be looking at for training, but this one right here just has to do training. So we have a desired objective, to keep your plant running in cold weather. And a secondary objective is with the data and information is to inform your operating agents, your RC, BA, and TOP of your capability. That if you can't keep your system operating, your generator operating, then you need to inform them, let them know what your capabilities are. So we've taken like 2 generic internal controls. When you think about it, a control for a performance, for this performance, keeping your generator operating, you'd say, an internal control is to have a procedure to do that. So we've turned that into a standard. Another internal control is to train your operators. Well, we've turned that into a standard. So we have those 2 items covered, but now we're going under so how well are you implementing that? What other controls or what other, how rigorous are you applying these 2 standards? And that's something that an auditor would want to know. So next slide. So we're going to look at the specifics of these two companies, Orco Electric Company, and what we have going into the audit for them. And as you heard Patrick mention, some of these things are a little bit duplicate to what he said. But looking at their compliance program, they've had a strong, compliance program. Now, no history of EOP 11, but they do seek information and expectation of new standards. Look at their WEC risk objectives. They focus on how they've incorporated the new standards in their compliance program. They've been audited before. They've asked questions before. They participate in outreach. And they've developed and communicated internal controls. And this is specific for EOP 11, R2 and R8 through their ICD-CT response. So we sent out, when we were planning to do this and got this became part of the audit scope, we sent out this internal controls request. They sent back a lot of information about their internal controls response. So we have some data for them. We know that they have various processes, checks, verifications in place, schedules to flag and make sure that they're implementing these 2 requirements. As far as the audit itself, the working paper is well written. So they've got a good narrative of how they implement these standards. It includes a discussion of their internal controls, their review processes. Their narrative is supported by dated documentation of maintenance performance. And for requirement 8, their working paper references included the training materials that were actually used, a summary of the training attendance by name and date of all the personnel that work for this organization. In the facilities, generation portfolio consists of thermal generation. It's located in a region that frequently experiences freezing weather. So on a yearly basis, they face freezing weather and precipitation. They've been addressing winter operations for many years. However, it was noted that they do have a new facility coming into service. And so it's kind of interesting. So how is this being incorporated? Is there any changes as this new facility comes into service that they're using specifically to address EOP 11? Next slide. So here's how we might approach do an approach to this audit. Now they did provide the cold weather preparedness plan, so that's pretty much a gimme for our 7. You know, the requirement is that you will have this plan, so they're going to provide the plan, and we're going to, of course, read it. But as we're reading it and reviewing it, we see it's very clear. All the required elements are addressed in the plan itself, except in this case, they didn't address fuel switching because it wasn't applicable. But they did identify that it was not applicable in their working papers and specified that's why we don't address it. So we think that's acceptable. There's no reason in your plan or your program why you have to put things in there that might be a distraction from the people using it. So they explained there was no fuel switching. Their published plan contained initiation triggers, in other words, when this plan would be implemented, multiple site-specific details that should result in timely and effective implementation and mitigation of cold weather conditions in a timely manner, because they not only are focusing on a yearly preparation, but they also are addressing current conditions, looking at weather, looking at forecasts, and implementing the plan if either they believe weather is going to be bad or severe at their facilities, or if they're informed by their TOP and BA that they're expecting cold weather. So we did hold one interview. So we looked at their information, held one interview to discuss at the entity's past lessons learned with cold weather. You know, how have they had any issues with any of their other plants as they've been operating, how that was considered for their new unit, and how that information that's included in those bullets was communicated to TOP and BA. Those are actually part of another standard. For TOP and BA, it's part of TOP 2, which was not in audit scope, of course, because we didn't include that. But the communication of that information is very important. So we wanted to find out exactly how that information was transmitted to TOP and BA. Is it transmitted to both? Do you give it to one and they give it to the other? And what process? Is it real time? Is it telephone calls at ICCP? How's that done? How are changes made? So the interview, we had an interview that discussed that. So that was pretty much it. For them, our 7, we didn't have to go any deeper, didn't have to do any sampling. There wasn't a lot to identify that was wrong with their plan. Next slide, please. So for requirement 8, here's one that they had a good training summary provided on a good preparedness plan. So their plan was good. They did good training on it. So in this case, we had an option. We could have gone and done a sample and picked some operators or all operators or whatever and said, we want to see those specific training records. Or we could have asked to interview some of their personnel and discuss the training with them and see if we got a feeling that the training was effective or if it actually occurred. But we were confident with the way they had conducted themselves previously, with their culture of compliance, with the training summary, with the material provided, that was good enough. So we made a decision in this case not to go any farther, not to make any specific requests for show me this training record and show me that training record, or to go and interview an auditor. So that was good enough for us. If we'd been doing a checkbox type training or checkbox type audit, we would have pretty much had to do that. We had to look at a statistical sample of the personnel and say, I want to see these records. And if you don't have records, I want to talk to those people and verify that they've attended the training. But in this case, we relaxed that requirement and thought this was good enough. Next slide, please. So here were the findings we came up with. We did find no findings of noncompliance for R7 or R8. There were no areas of concern or recommendations. We did make a positive observation related to their process for in-service validation of freeze protection based on temperature, in addition to the annual maintenance activities. In this case, when temperature, at least once a month during the winter, they would go out and actually test their heat trace system, verify lights came on, do some temperature checks that just for a little while to make sure that the system still worked. And also during the implementation of the plan, one of their steps was to go out and validate that the heat trace systems were actually operating and working. So our input to the compliance oversight plan that we would feedback is based on adequate documentation, evidence of internal controls and implementation, experience in cold weather. The recommendation of the risk team is that Orco should be considered a low risk with respect to OP 11-2 for the geo function. In the future, that might either reduce the frequency of when the OP 11 got placed into audit, or maybe switch over to another monitoring method, such as a self-certification. But we do recognize that it's a low risk. It doesn't mean it's no risk. All right, next. So for Sun Bear Power, it's a little different sort of a setup here for these folks. So as you heard from the previous risk group assessment of them, they have a history of noncompliance for other standards, and with apparent cause being poor or non-existent internal controls, lack of awareness of standards expectations, minimal knowledge of their compliance program just because they haven't provided it, so we haven't had a chance to adjust it. Therefore, the WEC risk objectives are directed more towards details of compliance with the standards. We can't put make any assumptions about the fact that they've got good control. So we have to say, well, we have to really look closer at their standards and did you meet the standard requirements? Their ICD-CT response limited the internal controls to the documents required by the standards. And you'll note I did say that a procedure is a control, and training is an internal control. So they just referenced those two requirements as their controls for cold weather. We'd like to see something more than that. And even though they might be considered controls to controls, we'd like to see something more about how they were developed, how they're reviewed, how they're maintained. So there wasn't very much there for their controls. So there wasn't any leeway granted for relaxing any assessments. For their data, they provided an RSAW, provided little insight other than referencing the two documents that they referenced in the ICD-CT, their cold weather prep plan. They stated no freeze protection was installed on its facilities. So if you look at what the requirement for the plan is, that pretty much would leave a good part of the plan blank. But initial training information was just a list of names and an attestation of completed training on the plan. But like I say, the plan didn't have a whole lot to it. But in the low risk side, their portfolio consisted exclusively of photovoltaic solar arrays located in a warm climate area, rarely subject to winter weather conditions. And out of all the different plant types, PV arrays are probably the least impacted by cold weather. Inverters and the panels themselves are relatively robust for cold weather purposes. One possibility is if there's any water or precipitation leakage that can freeze, that can damage panels, reduce capability. And then of course, any precipitation, snow or ice can impact the output of a PV facility. So it's not like there isn't any impact at all, but a relatively low risk based on what their facilities consisted of. Next slide, please. So our approach to audit for these folks was, of course, they did provide the plan, so we need to review that cold weather preparedness plan. We did note some elements specified to be addressed in the plan were not initially found in the plan. And specifically, fuel switching, which we know for a PV facility is not really applicable, but we don't know for sure if it wasn't even mentioned whether they have a standby generator there that performs some support function, if they have actually a CT or anything else on site that's not really part of the BES, but what could be something that needed to be looked at. So we couldn't find it specifically. They didn't mention it in their RSAW, so we thought we needed to explore that. Cold weather data for capabilities and availability only addressed design temperature, didn't consider any impacts of precipitation. And you say for a photovoltaic array, probably precipitation is probably more of an impact than cold weather. So we issued a data request to explain the items that cannot be located in the plan. And we decided to hold an interview to discuss how Sunbear would initiate the plan during cold weather event, because they also didn't include any trigger points. They put the bare minimum of what was stated in the standard, but it wasn't really a living, useful plan or document. It was kind of what we would consider a shelf decoration. But EOP 11 for this type of facility has a little bit of flexibility. There's not a whole lot that needs to be done other than the data. Next slide, please. So for their training on their cold weather preparedness plan, like I say, all they did was do an attestation and said that they trained on the plan. So we submitted data requests to provide attendance records of the training for the cold weather preparedness plan for all personnel who received the training. And then an interview was conducted with 2 selected staff personnel that had the training, just to discuss the content of the training, what they got out of it, what their expectations were to do. Did they know where the plan was? Was it available to them? And some elements like that. So it was a little bit more in-depth approach to Sunbear. Okay, next slide, please. And here's our findings. We did determine there were no findings of noncompliance, that they did meet the requirements of standard. They did have documentation that addressed those missing items that we were looking for in their plan. Their preparedness plan did exist. It met minimum required content. We did have some areas of concern. One area of concern was that they didn't include any process for implementing inspection or monitoring of conditions at its facilities before or during cold weather conditions, just to identify any potential impacts. Associated also with cold weather is possibility of snow, possibility of freezing rain, possibility of high winds, and their facilities could be subject to impacts from those things. So the idea that cold temperature doesn't hurt them, therefore they're not concerned, we didn't think was adequate. So we found an area of concern that they should modify their plan to make that a little bit more robust. Another area of concern was they didn't include an assessment of conditions that might trigger implementation of their preparedness plan. There wasn't anything for themselves to look at what the weather might be, what the forecast might be, and letting the TOP BARC know of any capability restrictions that they might have due to weather. It could be even as much as heavy cloud cover. During a cold weather event that's impacting a large number of facilities, a PV setup might be something you're depending on, although its output is expected to drop based on cloud cover. So being aware and communicating what your limitations are is something that the operating entities would probably like to know. So that was an area of concern, that they were very much a sort of a standoff approach to this. Next slide. The other area of concern is they didn't include a process to update their weather data when they were reporting to TOP and BA due to capabilities due to freezing precipitation in its facilities. And we know in this case, precipitation is not explicitly addressed in EOP 11-2, but it can have significant impact on PV stations and on wind farms. So we also provide a recommendation while overall risk of impact due to extreme cold weather for Sunbury power facilities is low. Output of generation can be much lower than normal capability during severe weather that is impacting other nearby facilities. So the audit team recommends they perform an assessment of impacts to capability for use during severe cold weather events to keep their operating entities up to speed on what their capabilities are. Next slide. We also said that they have a recommendation for to retrain following enhanced or changes to the cold weather preparedness plan. The reason we put that in there, even though they did have the initial training, is that we did make recommendations for them to change their plan. And so we wanted to remind them if they do change their plan, they need to retrain their people on at least the changes to that plan. Our input to compliance oversight, based on facility type and location, we still think it's that the BES risk due to cold weather is low for this entity. However, improvements to plans could help mitigate regional situational awareness. The plans are minimally adequate for current standard, and internal controls are not formalized. So they should be considered for follow-up due to the areas of concern, and reassessed for any changes to standards, or footprint, or any facility changes they have. In other words, we're not confident that they would keep up and implement new procedures and new plans based on changes that they realize. Next slide. So the conclusions, and it was kind of tough for these two relatively simple requirements to show a broad difference between audit approaches. But I didn't want to emphasize that performance history and experience can influence the level of detail auditors seek to establish for reasonable assurance of compliance. Internal controls that attempt to assure capability and preparation to perform functions to reduce perceived risk can impact the way auditors look at compliance. And entity experience can vary based on information provided. Auditor conclusions are inputs into the compliance oversight plan that can be used for future monitoring consideration. Next. And that's all I have, unless there are some questions.
We have received some questions. Let me go ahead and pull the first one up for you. How do we handle getting cold weather limitation data for equipment? Most equipment is only concerned with overheating limitations.
So there are three options for coming up with that's specified in the standard for coming up with those limitations. One of them is the design, the data that comes with the equipment. Some do have cold weather limitations. In fact, I know that inverters do, although it's very cold. It's usually minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's one method, is to get the design data. Another method is to do some type of analysis, an engineering analysis, and look at the equipment and say, hey, is this a pipe isn't necessarily going to be subject to cold weather, but what's inside it might be. And the other is that it gives the option of actually performance history, that you can go back and look at, hey, we have operated during this particular cold weather event with absolutely no issues. So you could say, well, we know we can operate there. Can we go any lower? We might. There's going to be more guidance coming out in future phases of the cold weather standards project. But for right now, it's one of those cases where the auditors aren't going to dictate to you how to come up with those numbers. You just need to come up with something that you can communicate that this is where we're guaranteed to operate.
Thank you. What would WEC expect as a cold weather plan for a battery energy storage system which does not use water within pipes that might freeze, like synchronous facilities?
Well, it's very similar to what we just talked about with the with Sunbear there, that a battery is another a commercial battery, which typically they're not lead acid storage type batteries. they're not particularly susceptible to cold weather. However, I would be willing to bet that their output does change with cold weather, at least until they are actually operating and discharging, and that might change. So being aware of what the cold weather capabilities are for output and timing for the battery, that type of data is important. Other than that, there may not be any freeze considerations. And the batteries usually are outside, these commercial batteries. So I don't think they'd be necessarily subject to a lot of precipitation. But there may be ancillary equipment around that for monitoring capabilities, protection systems, various things that potentially could be subject to cold weather that could terminate or reduce the operation of the battery. So it's important to look not just at the device itself, but at the auxiliary components that support its operation, and see if there's anything there that might impact cold weather operation. And if there is, those are the type of things that should be included in your plan.
Thank you. How will you be auditing R1.2.6 and R2.29 for the TOP and BA functions?
That wasn't part of this this presentation. So those are the and I don't have the standard right in front of me right now. I believe those are the requirements for those entities, the BA and the TOP, to include a requirement to collect cold weather data from the GOs. So it has they have to have a plan, also a emergency operations plan that covers more than just cold weather. The new standards included requirements that they modify their plans and specifically include requesting this cold weather data from the GOs. So we would be looking at the plan and see how they did that, what they included, how they were going to get this this data and this information, and how they were going to use it. And that is it's a big question, because some TOPs have literally hundreds of generators. And so how are they planning to collate this information in something that's usable? So we'll have to see. We believe they're going to be getting the data via their data request process, TOP3. But how they're going to actually collate and use that data on a forecast basis is something we're going to have to look at. But that's what we'll be looking at in their plan, is how. When do you request it? How often do you get it? What do you do with it when you get it?
Thank you. If there is no trigger for an extreme cold weather event because the unit can operate at extreme cold, does a plant still need a process to identify cold weather events?
Well, I think that I think right now, I think that would be a wise thing to do. But like I say, that's something that's really the basis for this this presentation, was to identify that that all aspects of a standard may not apply to all facilities. There should be some justification if you don't have a trigger. If you have absolutely no risk of ever reducing output due to cold weather, all you have to do is convince the auditors that's true, and then you probably don't need those triggers.
Okay. Is initial training versus retraining written anywhere?
No, well, in a way it is. If you read between the lines in the standard, it says that all operating and maintenance personnel must be trained in the cold weather preparedness plan. So if you create your plan, you perform the training with everyone, so that's satisfied. Now, if you change your plan, now that training is no longer valid, because they're not trained on your current plan. They're trained on your previous plan. So we don't call it retraining, but they have to be trained on your current plan.
Thank you. You mentioned how cold weather would affect a generation unit and the audit team's approach to risk-based audit. Are entities expected to implement controls to address how the cold weather would impact transmission operations?
When you're saying entities, as in for R7 and R8, no, Generator operators are not really expected to do that. Now, there are a few cases where we might say yes. Possible configuration where a generator owner operated SF6 breakers, or breakers that connected their facility to the transmission operator. If any of those components were subject to cold weather limitations, those should be included in the plan also. In other words, I guess one way of saying it is it's not restricted. If you're a GO, it's not restricted to just the facilities that are defined as a generating facility in FAC 8. It can extend onto any support equipment or any other equipment that could limit your output due to cold weather.
Okay.
As far as other transmission equipment not owned by the GO, that's a different part of the plan. And yes, the transmission owners need to have, or transmission operators need to have that included in their plan for cold weather operations.
Thank you. For plants that regularly see extreme cold, high wind, deep snow, and freezing rain, the process for maintaining operations during these events are not always put in a procedure, but are a normal part of operator duties. Is a separate procedure required specifically for cold weather?
I think what we're implying with the requirement to have a cold weather preparation plan is that yes, those items that may certainly have been done, particularly if you're in a cold weather location, you have been addressing cold weather through various processes in the past. Those should be part of your cold weather preparation plan. It does recognize the fact that you can have multiple cold weather preparation plans. So if you have certain procedures and processes that are working now, those can be incorporated by reference. You're not necessarily, don't have to rewrite them or include them in a new plan. But if those functions and tasks that are being performed are necessary to operate during cold weather, they should be part of your preparation plan or reference in your preparation plan.
Okay. Does environmental constraints consideration refer to plant emission limitations only? What other environmental constraints is WEC looking at? Maybe now consideration of freezing precipitation, any others?
So the term of environmental constraints, I think, is typically been considered as being able to relax environmental constraints. In other words, if there are air quality issues and emission standards and noise standards that are placed on some facilities, and if those can be relaxed during emergencies, then those are environmental constraints that should be addressed in the plan. Is how do you get those relaxed? How do you change those? Other than that, environmental, the things associated with cold weather itself, that's part of the cold weather plan. Cold weather is an environment thing that may have a restriction, but that's not what we're looking at from the environmental constraint aspect. Those are more regulatory environmental constraints.
Okay. If the cold weather plan is an internal control, why would you need another internal control?
The reason is because once something gets put in a standard for any standard, and as Scott and Patrick, as they pointed out when they were doing their presentation, they talked about concerns of failure to doing certain things. Internal controls are a set of processes that you put in place to prevent failures from occurring and ensuring that you get your business objectives met, or that a standard is complied with. So typically one control is not enough. So if there's no requirement for a procedure, then having a procedure is a control. If you do have a requirement for a procedure, then you can you look at another layer and say, was that procedure approved? Is it formal? Was it distributed? And those are controls. Very similar to FAC 3, which is there's really only one performance objective there, and that's to keep your trees from going into transmission lines. Doing annual inspections is a control, but it's also a standard. But then you have another control that how do you track that? How do you make sure that those annual inspections are done? So you have to think of controls as layers of barriers and layers that will ensure your objectives are met. So procedure is one type of control. When that becomes a standard, then we look to see what other weaknesses could there be in your procedure that could be that could have a control to make it better.
Okay. Can you clarify what you're looking for regarding capability? Is it sufficient for the plan to say that units are all full load capable during cold weather, or is an auditor looking for specific megawatt capability?
I would say for the auditor is not going to make that call. I think that where the answer to that is going to come from is from the TOP or BA when they make their data request for capability. They may want to know a megawatt capability, or they may want, if they know that it's full capability or impacts the capability, they may only want to know if there's changes. But I don't think the auditors are going to dictate what that is. It's just, it does need to be included in some form or the other.
Okay. It looks like we have one additional question. You mentioned that all O&M personnel needed to be trained. If your plan only requires specific personnel, then you are only required to train the staff responsible for implementation, correct?
I would say that's true, that we're looking for personnel that have tasks associated with implementing your preparation plan.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil, and thank you everyone for your questions. That was an excellent session. We will take a break until 2 p.m. and then we will have our supply chain risk management session. We'll see you all there. Oh, I'm sorry, 2:15. We are ending at 2 p.m. Thank you, everyone.